Without any further ado, we all know our great esteemed guest who has traveled over the Atlantic Ocean to be with us, Lord Monckton. Thank you
Many
so
thanks
much for being with us again.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Monckton.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, rebellious colonials, your founding fathers meditated long and hard on what is known as the philosophy of government. And the very first people that we know of who studied the philosophy of government, what makes government tick, what it's for, what it should and shouldn't do, were the Chinese under the early Chinese Empire, thousands of years ago. And they decided that there were really only two forms of government. On the one hand, there was totalitarianism, which they called legalism. And totalitarianism means that the government controls every tiny aspect of your life, down to the last flickering, poison-filled mercury light bulb that they require you to use rather than proper light bulbs, on the one hand. And on the other, what they called Confucianism, and we call libertarianism, which gives as much freedom as possible to the individual and makes the government as small as possible and as accountable as possible to the people that it serves. And to this day, in Hong Kong, the school children write essays on the contrast between legalism, which we call totalitarianism, and Confucianism, which we call libertarianism. Now, Confucius, or Kung Fuji, was a philosopher of early imperial China. He knew and quite liked the emperor, but he did not like the fact that imperial China was fiercely totalitarian, fiercely centralist. Everything was controlled by bureaucrats, and the people had very little wealth or power or freedom of their own. Now, in that context, your founding fathers decided that they wished to have which kind of government? Totalitarian or libertarian? Anyone like to say?
Libertarian.
Somebody said that?
Yes.
I want to see one of the campers.
The campus, come on.
The question is this: your founding fathers established a constitution which you've been learning about this week. Was it a libertarian constitution or a totalitarian constitution? Was it one that gave you lots of freedom or guaranteed you lots of freedom on the one hand, or was it one that took those freedoms away and said you can't have them on the other? Which was it? Ma'am? It was libertarian, are you saying? Or totalitarian? Which? Libertarian. Quite right. Your founding fathers wanted you to be as free as possible. Did this mean anarchy, which means no government at all? No. There had to be a government to do certain things, such as provide for the common defense, for instance, such to administer the justice system. You have to have a government to do things like that. But they wanted the government to do as little as possible, to take as little as possible of your wealth and of your power and your freedom away from you, so that you, the people, would constitute the state, would constitute the government. And that's where democracy comes in. And of course, you have heard that democracy is, if it was unbridled, could lead to the mob deciding to do something silly, which later they might all come to regret. And so you have checks and balances, as we call them, and you call it a republic, which prevent your democratic system from becoming what in ancient Greece would have been known as an ochlocratic system, ruled by the mob rather than by the educated people, constrained by the rule of law. So, after the Second World War, the nations of Europe were trashed. They were ruined because there was one country in Europe, previously the most civilized of all Europe's countries, had gone off the rails completely, And what kind of government was the Nazi government? Was it a totalitarian government or a libertarian government? Anybody other than Mr. Constitution? Yes, sir, over there at the back. It was totalitarian, quite right. It was almost the worst of all totalitarian governments. There have been worse ones. Can anybody name worse ones since? China, quite right. China has killed more of its own citizens than any other nation on earth ever. Yep. And is still doing so. And what is more, China at the moment is imprisoning at least 1 million, and on some counts 3 million Muslims, the Uyghurs, in Western China, simply because they don't fit the communist totalitarian model. They imprison them in concentration camps, just as Hitler did with the Jews. How many people are being killed in those concentration camps, we do not even know, any more than we knew that while Hitler was doing it, until we invaded Germany and found out. So totalitarianism tends to lead to death in the tens or even hundreds of millions. If you take fascism, which was Hitler's type of philosophy, that in fact was called by him National Socialism. And the communists in Russia, who also killed tens of millions, and in China, they call themselves International Socialists. Do you get the pattern? Socialism, stroke communism, stroke fascism, they are all very slight variations of the same central idea, which is totalitarianism. But any country that trusts its citizens enough to allow them to vote at regular intervals to replace the government they had before with a government more to their liking, what kind of a government is that? Is it libertarian or totalitarian? Any other campus, please? Well, Mr. Constitution, you're always there. Let's hear you. Libertarian, of course. A democratic system is inherently libertarian because the people decide who their government is going to be, and just as importantly, who their government is not going to be. By this means, they can preserve as much as possible of their individual freedom of action and freedom over their own property and freedom over their own wealth, to retain as much of it as they want while sharing some of it with the government for those purposes which they collectively regard as acceptable to be run in common. Now, I run through this dichotomy, this difference between, on the one hand, ruthless totalitarian government, which is government either by a tyrant or by an oligarchy, which means government by the through. Monarchy is government by the one, and oligarchy is government by the few. Oligos, few in Greek. All of these words come from Greek because the Greek philosophers of government are what led your founding fathers to understand all these distinctions. So when Europe trashed after the Second World War, after the appalling damage that Hitler had done, after the killing of approximately 6 million Jews in the concentration camps, and the killing of some 40 million people overall in the conflict worldwide, Europe needed to rebuild itself. And so the first thing they needed were two things which you will now not be able to get hold of very easily in America because global warming. And what were those two things? Coal and steel. They needed coal to drive power stations to give people electricity, and they needed steel to rebuild the crumbled fabric of Europe, to put up new buildings and get Europe moving again. So what they did was to establish an outfit called the European Coal and Steel Community. And this was a purely bureaucratic arrangement to make sure that those countries like Britain which had plenty of coal and plenty of steel, because Hitler never succeeded in invading us, they would share their coal and steel on an agreed basis with those countries in Europe that didn't have enough. So it was a very sensible arrangement, and it was a very common sense, practical, working arrangement. But then along came some politicians from Europe, and they said, we don't ever want a war in Europe again. So we want to have a political structure that will make war less likely. So now we stop again and we think of the philosophy of government. Which kind of government in Europe would be most likely to avoid and prevent war? A totalitarian government or a libertarian government? Any of the campers? And we'll go to you, ma'am. Stand up and say properly so everyone can hear. Stronger.
Libertarian.
That's better. Now everybody can hear you. And so whenever you're speaking in public, even if you're just raising a question, stand up, chest out, dig it up right from here is where your voice comes. Libertarian. That's right. If you want not to have a war, a libertarian government is a good thing, except in one circumstance. And that is, if you get a totalitarian government that behaves as badly as Hitler's government did, and all negotiation had been attempted and had failed, the only thing you can then do is go to war. So you will often get wars between totalitarian regimes and another totalitarian regime. That is where most wars come from. You will get occasionally, as we did in the Second World War, wars between libertarian governments like that of Britain and the totalitarian government of Hitler. But as far as I can remember, there has never been any full-blown war between any libertarian government and any other libertarian government. Can anyone think why that is? Why do libertarian governments not fight against other libertarians? At the back, ma'am. Yes, your hand is half up. Come along. You must know. Anyone? Well, yes, ma'am, yes.
Because they're separate and they don't want to stand.
Stand up and say it. Let's hear your voice.
I'm just guessing, but is it...
Louder.
I'm just guessing, but is it because they're separate and don't really want to?
The people won't stand for it. You were very, very close. We, the people, if we control our governments, we're going to say to those governments, if you go to war against another libertarian government, a democratic government, we won't stand for that. And so that's why you don't get wars between libertarian governments and other libertarian governments. It just basically doesn't happen. If it does happen, it's very much the exception rather than the rule. So libertarian governments, and those are the governments where the people have a really good degree of control over who their government is, how long they stay in office for, those governments are the ones that are most likely to establish peace in the world. So, now that we understand this background in the philosophy of government, supposing the countries of Europe wanted to establish a form of umbrella government, so you'd still have individual states like France and Germany and more recently Britain, and you then wanted to have a kind of umbrella government for the whole of Europe. If you wanted to keep the peace, and you wanted there to be peace in Europe, what kind of a government would you establish in the European Union? Anybody other than Mr. Constitution, who of course knows the answer? Anybody else? Come along. What kind of government would you want to establish in Europe to keep the peace? Yes, sir. A libertarian government. A government where the people elect the people who run the government. So the next question is, they did set up a European system of government. Originally, it was simply an economic free trade area with a few bells and whistles attached. But then, more recently, in 1992, by the Treaty of Maastricht, which is a town in Holland, they decided to establish a European Union, which was effectively a kind of United States of Europe. Now, how long do you think that the constitution of the European Union is? Is it short, like your constitution, or is it long? Anyone like to guess? Yes, ma'am. Very long is the correct answer. Can we make sure that you get some camp bucks? Because for working that out, you did very well. Now, very long is the answer. What the European Union did is it set up a series of treaties, each of them hundreds, and even in one or two cases, thousands of pages long. And then on top of that, they add every year 80,000 new laws and regulations, so that we are now burdened by an enormous number of these laws and regulations. Now, do you think that a government that was elected by its people would impose that amount of complication and regulation on the people? The answer is no. From that, you begin to get the idea that the new government that was established of the European Union, it's a kind of federal arrangement. It was not the enlightened, democratic, republican government that you have here. Nor was it the enlightened constitutional monarchy that we have in Britain, where we have the Queen, who is the head of state, but she is not the head of government. We choose the government, so we choose the head of government. So the Queen does not rule over us absolutely as a tyrant. She is there merely to embody the symbolism of the nation and the history of the nation, and she does not directly govern except in very limited circumstances. So, the European system of government that was established for the European Union is, if it isn't a libertarian system of government, and it isn't, what kind of a system of government is it? Anyone? Yes, sir. Totalitarian. Exactly. And what happens if you have totalitarian government? People die. Yep. So that's why we are nervous in Britain about belonging any longer to this totalitarian entity, the European Union. Now, you now have quite a good idea of how a law is made in a libertarian system such as the United States. Who has the sole legislative power? Who has all legislative power in the United States? Anyone? Yes, ma'am, at the back. By proxy, yes, but who in your Constitution, at Article 1, Section 1, has all legislative power? Yes, ma'am, in the front here. Congress, quite right. Can we have some camp bucks for this lady too? Yeah. That is absolutely correct. It is Congress. Your Constitution starts out right at the beginning. The first thing it says, all legislative power herein granted shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of, anyone? Ma'am, yes? Stand up and let's hear it loud. A Senate and House of Representatives, period. Nobody else has any legislative power over you. And who chooses both houses of the Congress? Come on, ma'am, you in pink. Who chooses both houses of Congress?
We do.
We do. Quite right. We, the people, desirous of establishing among ourselves, etc., etc. We, the people, elect the Congress. I say, you, the people. We, mere peers of the realm, no longer have the power over you to do that. But you have the power to do this. And so, if we were intending or if the Europeans who did this were intending to have a libertarian form of government, they would have made sure that there was an elected European Assembly or Parliament or Congress, and that that elected body would be the sole body that had the right to bring forward and enact legislation. So in Congress, the first step in making a new law, or in unmaking or repealing or amending, changing an old law, is called a bill. And who can bring forward a bill to Congress? Anyone? Yes, ma'am. Stand up and be good and loud. Nope. Yes, ma'am. Stand up.
The House of Representatives.
Any senator or any member of the House of Representatives. So you get some camp bucks, you didn't quite get it right. A bill can be introduced in either house, but it has to be introduced by a member of that house and seconded by another member of that house, and usually supported by half a dozen others, just to get it into the hopper, as it's called, from which eventually it is timetabled for debate. And it has to pass through several stages of debate in each of the two houses, and then where does it go, and where does it not become a law unless it goes? Who signs off on it and says, okay, this is now a law, once it's been passed by both houses of Congress? Yes, ma'am, in the front. Stand up. Mr. President signs the law. That's right. And if he doesn't sign the law, is it a law? No, it isn't. So you have the three essential elements in making a bill. It has to start in one house, proposed by members of that house. It has to go to the other house and be passed by that house. And only then, and only if the president agrees to it, does it become a law. If he does not agree to it, it doesn't become a law, because he has exercised his power of, does anybody know what it's called? Yes, sir. Veto. Camp bucks for somebody who knows that quite obscure word. Well done. Veto. It comes from the Latin, I forbid. And he can forbid it by just not agreeing to sign it. He withholds his signature, he vetoes the law. So now, does the European Union have a parliament in that sense? Anyone? Is there such a thing as a European Parliament? Anyone? Well, yes, there is a so-called European Parliament, and it is even elected by us. It only has one chamber. It's not what is known as a unicameral legislature, rather than what you have here and what we have in Britain, a bicameral legislature. Bi meaning two, uni meaning one, camera meaning chamber. So you have the chamber of the House of Representatives and you have the chamber of the Senate. So you are a bicameral legislature. The European Union appears to be a unicameral legislature. But there's just one problem, and about 99% of the people of Europe don't know this, because the treaties that define all this are so long and obscure that it's impossible to make it out. There isn't one simple handy document that says this is your constitution that people like you can study and read in half an hour, and you know roughly how the government is shaped. No way. There's these thousands and thousands of turgid pages of bureaucraties, completely incomprehensible. And hidden in there is the news that no member of the European Parliament, even though he has been elected by the people of the member state who sent him there, has the right to bring forward a bill to that Parliament. Now, what kind of a Parliament is that? What we call it in Britain is a Parliament of eunuchs. It has absolutely no power even to bring forward a bill. Now you begin to see why the mother of parliaments, which is the British Parliament, where only the elected representatives of the people in either house, in the Commons, or the unelected but appointed by a higher authority representatives of the people in the upper house, only they can bring forward a bill. But in the European Parliament, who then can bring forward a bill? Well, the answer is each member state appoints, not elects, appoints an unelected commissar. Who has heard the word commissar before? A commissar is a term invented in Russia for an unelected bureaucrat under a communist system. And the official German name for what we call the European commissioners, they call them what they actually are, which is communist officials. They are commissars. Only the commissars can bring forward a bill for consideration by the elected European Parliament. Now you might think, well, okay, the European Parliament doesn't have the probulitic function, that is the function of bringing forward, shaping, defining and drawing up legislation, but at least they have the power of decision. Who here thinks that the ultimate power of decision in the European legislative system lies in the hands of the elected Parliament of Europe? I see no hands, so you all get camp bucks because you're quite right. Of course, there is no final power of decision with the European Parliament. I mean, you couldn't make this up. Yes, a question.
Yes.
Stand up.
The commissar sounds similar to what we see happening here in the United States when it comes to COGS, Council of Governments, unelected, self-appointed bureaucrats or people within a group who are taking federal money to implement regionalism throughout the United States. Would you say it's comparable?
That's right. Every time you give real decision-making power and the power of the purse, as it is called, the power to spend taxpayers' money, to people not only that are not elected by you, but are not directly accountable to those who are elected by you, then you have a problem. And so increasingly, even in the United States, you are getting agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency, for instance, which have no constitutional place. They do not exist in your constitution. They shouldn't be there. And yet Congress has decided to delegate, to hand away its power of control over these things to an agency which, although it theoretically is answerable to Congress, increasingly, because there are so many of these agencies, Congress doesn't have the time to supervise them and regulate them properly. And that is how you lose democracy little by little. But in Europe, the people who framed the European Union, so-called, were determined that at no point should the people have any significant input into the way Europe is run. And so let me tell you exactly how a law gets made in Europe. And the reason I tell you this is that this will give you some idea of just how wonderful your constitution is, just how valuable it is, because it protects you, at least to some degree, against what is happening to us in Europe. The first stage in bringing forward a new law or repealing or amending an old one is the commissars put the law forward, and then the European Parliament has no choice but to debate it. It must debate that new law. It doesn't have to pass it, though. It can reject it. If it passes it, well, okay, at least there's been some element of democracy in the proceedings. Still not good enough, but it's a start. But then it gets worse. Supposing the European Parliament says, no, we don't want this law. Does no mean no?
No.
No, it doesn't. Quite right. No means, right, you got that wrong. So what then happens is that a reconciliation commission is appointed from an unelected body called the Council of Ministers. And very often the people who attend the Council of Ministers are not ministers, they're not elected, they are bureaucrats. Very seldom do ministers actually go to the so-called Council of Ministers. And then there's a few people from the European Parliament, and of course sitting over them all are the commissars. And they all get together and they try to decide what's going to happen to the law. And at that point the European Parliament might cave in and say, okay, it's a fair cop, we'll pass it for the sake of having a quiet life. Yes, sir?
I've read quite a lot about the EU over the years. Is it true that the first president of the EU, Walter Heinstein, was actually a Nazi war criminal?
There have been officials of the EU who have had that background, yes. We are not dealing with a democratic system here. And right from the outset, it was set up to be totalitarian. So we're going through the establishment of how a law goes through. So suppose it, yes?
The Council of Ministries, yes?
Council of Ministers,
Ministers.
yes.
It sounds very similar to our Council of Governments. Are your Council of Ministers influenced by what we call squeaky wheel lobbyists?
Oh, very much so. The entire European dictatorship runs on who yells loudest. And of course, any form of government tends to some extent to go that way. But the danger, if you concentrate all power in the hands of a very few people, and if you do not then make sure that those few people are answerable to the electorate and can be removed by them, then you can transform yourself by slow and inexorable stages from democracy to oligarchy, which is just a form of tyranny exercised by a few rather than by one. So in the European Union, if the Council of Ministers getting together with the European Parliament decides the law shall be a law, then it becomes a law. Suppose they don't. Does no mean no? Anyone?
No.
No? Good guess. It doesn't mean no. Because at any time, the commissars can decide, and indeed any individual commissar acting on his own without even consulting the others, can issue what is called a Commission regulation. And this regulation is exactly the same thing as a law. It has the same power as a law. It is the supreme law of the European Union. It is enacted throughout the European Union. All the member states have to obey it, even though that law may never have been in front of any parliament, including the European Parliament, even though it has never been voted for, even though it has never been debated. One commissar can issue an edict or ukase or command requiring that law to be put into effect. And we are at present obliged, under pain of imprisonment, to obey. Hands up all those who think that that is in any recognizable or useful sense democracy. Hands up all those who think that in that system there are the due checks and balances that protect the interests of the people. Correct. Not a single hand is raised. Now you can see why it is that 3 years ago, in the largest vote ever held in Britain on any subject, 1.75 million people was the margin between those who voted to leave the European Union so that we could get our democracy and our government back, and those who voted to stay in the European Union and continue to be ruled by commissars over whom we have no power whatsoever. Yes, sir?
Sorry, what did you say the margin was?
1.75 million. So 52% to 48 if you want it in percentages, but a clear margin of 1.75 million. In other words, whenever you get a vote to decide between democracy and various forms of tyranny, whether it be absolute monarchy or absolute oligarchy, it tends to be 50-50. Why is this? Because so big is government these days that it tends to employ large numbers of people directly, and they will tend to vote to maintain the oligarchy or tyranny because their power is enhanced thereby. And it's the ordinary people, the working people in particular in Britain, who voted in enormous numbers to say, we do not want these people whom we do not elect governing us anymore. So we said, right, we're voting to leave. And did that mean that we left?
No.
By now, you're getting used to the way democracy works in Europe. Whatever the people vote for, they get the opposite. So we voted to leave. And what then happened was that a bigwig in the City of London brought a court case against the government saying you must not write to the European Union and say we're leaving, because if you do, then we will take you to court. We'll say you can't do that because the exercise by ministers of what's called the royal prerogative, a discretionary power that allows ministers to make, say, treaties with foreign governments, they can't exercise that power if it would have the effect of changing pre-existing British legislation unless they have asked Parliament first. Now, coming out of the European Union would indeed have changed legislation, but it was our treaty obligation under one of this confetti of treaties that governs the European Union that we should write and say bye-bye the moment we had, under our constitutional arrangements, the Referendum Act, decided that we were leaving. It was therefore not an exercise of the royal prerogative. It was an exercise of a treaty obligation. We were required to write that letter. So did the government, in defending itself against this bigwig from the city, did it argue the point I've just made, that it had no choice but to write that letter? The people had voted for it, and the governing law of Europe, the Lisbon Treaty, said we had to write. Did they argue that? Anyone?
Probably not.
No, they didn't. At no stage in the proceedings, it went all the way up to our Supreme Court, did the government ever argue the obvious point that it was their treaty obligation to write that letter, and therefore it was not an exercise of the royal prerogative, because the royal prerogative is a discretionary power. You can use it or not as you please, but they had to write the letter, so there was no discretion. That simple, elementary point of law, which even I, not even a lawyer, can understand. Even you, not even lawyers, can understand. At no point did our elected government make that point. Why not? Because they did not wish us to leave the European Union. Theresa May, the elected, well, she wasn't the elected Prime Minister, she was appointed. Theresa May knew that if she could cause 6 to 9 months delay in sending that letter by letting that court case run through all the courts, which is exactly what happened, then 2 years after that, because that's what happens under the law, once you have written to them, it's only 2 years after that that you get free of the European Union. By then, along could come all the supporters of tyranny, and you have your supporters of tyranny here. You call them Democrats. Goodness knows why. They're not. They're communists. But you call them Democrats. Well, we have the Socialist parties, the Liberal Democrat Party. They're neither liberal nor democratic. We have the Labour Party, which no longer has anything to do with working people. We have the Welsh National Party, which has nothing to do with the Wales and nothing to do with nationalism. We have the Scottish, the National Socialist Workers' Party of Scotland, which has nothing to do with Scotland or with working. All these strangely badly named parties of the left, they all wanted to make sure we stayed in the European Union. And why? Because on the socialist, communist left, they do not like democracy. They do not like you having your say over how you are governed. And so they wanted the Union to be there, because the European Union was doing their job for them. We could vote for whatever government we liked in Britain, but if the supreme law is made by communist commissars somewhere else, that makes the communists in Britain happy, but it doesn't make the people of Britain happy. So now I hope you've got some idea of just how important it is to those of us who believe in the power of the people to constrain, to elect, to remove, to control their governments, that we should get free of the European Union, which in all meaningful senses denies us the right to elect or constrain or control or remove our governments. Because the supreme law of Europe is not made in the British Parliament. It's not made in the European Parliament. It is made by the fiat of unelected commissars. And that is our central problem with the European Union. Sir?
Is Brexit going to happen? And if it does, how is it going to happen?
There is a very good question, which in fact was the one I was just about to come on to. Because we voted for it, we haven't yet got it. So we threw out Theresa May, the useless Theresa May, probably the least successful, least competent Prime Minister in the history of our country. Spectacularly useless. And now we have a slobbering, gibbering giant in the name of Boris Johnson. And he looks like a fool, but he isn't. He studied classics at Oxford, as I did at Cambridge. And he got a first-class degree in classics at Oxford, as I didn't at Cambridge. And I got a rather less good degree than that. And he is a good brain. And he is determined, for the very reasons I have outlined, because he, like me, studied the classics. He studied the origins of democracy in ancient Greece and Rome. Where does the word democracy come from? Which nation gave us that word? Anyone?
Greece.
Ancient Greece, exactly. So he, like me, studied the gradual emergence and eventual disappearance of democracy in ancient Greece. Same thing in ancient Rome. They had what they called a republic. It had quite a strong democratic element. Eventually, it passed away and became a rather flashy empire, which lasted for hundreds of years, and then was replaced by invasion from, among other places, Germany. So, we, having studied the history and philosophy of government, feel particularly strongly that we must have our democracy back. So Boris Johnson entirely understands that. What's more, he understands that the ruling Conservative Party, which I used to belong to when I worked for Margaret Thatcher, I now belong to the Brexit Party. Because the Conservative Party has been too limp-wristed in pursuing this. But we're hoping that Boris does the deal and gets us out of the European Union. He's got until October the 31st to comply with the timetable that would otherwise simply leave us leaving automatically. Now, Parliament, 3/4 of our elected Parliament, does not believe in democracy. They're willing enough to be elected, but then they don't want it anymore after that. So they are going to try to stop him from leaving the European Union. The pretext, they say, we don't want to leave the European Union without having a new trade deal with Europe. Well, here's how I would deal with that. We already have trading arrangements with Europe, and we'll leave the European Union on the due date, which is the 31st of October this year at 11:30 p.m. And if there is no trade deal in place by then, we will simply continue trading with Europe on exactly the same basis as we trade with them now. It's as simple as that. You don't need any more complications. Now, the European Union says, oh, but then if you've left the European Union, even though you might want to do that, we would have to impose all sorts of extra checks and scrutinies and this and that because you're no longer a member of the club. What does that tell you about how much they value us as a member of that club? Yep. They have complete contempt for us. And that's why they want to put totally unnecessary restrictions in the way of our leaving. And that again is the mark not of a democratic but of a totalitarian system that is really upset that we do not love totalitarianism. So Boris is going to have to work a rather interesting trick. If he puts any bill before Parliament in the next 3 months, that bill can be amended by the majority in Parliament that doesn't want Brexit, so as to make it impossible for him to leave without a deal on the 31st of October. They've already tried to do this a couple of times before. And although it is not permissible to bring forward an amendment to a bill which is not within the scope of what that bill is supposed to be about. If it's a bill about drains, you can't suddenly tack on a thing about the European Union. That's not correct. But, unfortunately, not only are 3/4 of the members of Parliament in favour of staying in the dictatorship, but so is the Speaker of the House. And even though it is his duty to reject any amendment that goes beyond the scope of any bill that the government might bring in, and therefore prevent them from trashing the will of the people, he will allow such amendments. He is a thoroughly dishonest and thoroughly disreputable and very nasty little man. I've known him since he was at Oxford and I was at Cambridge. He was unpleasant then and he's even more unpleasant now. And he's fat as well. So we are desperate to break free. Our Prime Minister is desperate to break free. He was only able to appoint half of his cabinet who are people who want to break free. The other half, because there are just so many people who want to remain in the Conservative Party, so half of them in his cabinet want us to stay. In fact, slightly more want us to stay than want us to leave. So will we break free? If he has anything to do with it, we will. But he's not going to find it easy. But if he does, the Conservative Party at any subsequent election is going to win an enormous majority of the vote. So I conclude by saying to you this. You have no idea how strongly I admire your Constitution, how strongly I admire your founding fathers for having framed that Constitution in full consultation with the people. They didn't just shut themselves in that hall in Philadelphia in that long, hot, sticky global warming summer. They instead, through Madison and John Jay and Alexander Hamilton, they wrote daily and circulated widely to all the people the deliberations that were going on. They invited the people to write in and comment and get in touch with their representatives and make suggestions. This was a constitution framed by and for the people. And it was your president, Abraham Lincoln, who in that wonderful Gettysburg Address, arguably the finest speech ever delivered, just 286 words of it, he said this, that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Amen to that.
All right.
Many thanks. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
Do you have concern with where the United States is heading right now, and why?
That's a very good question. By now, I think many of you, through listening to your instructors here today, will realize there are very grave grounds for concern about the way America is headed. Because democracy can only work, for one thing, if there is freedom of speech and debate. But one of the two parties now in Congress, the so-called Democrats, who are really much closer to communists than they are to anything to do with democracy, on subject after subject after subject, they say there must be no debate at all. There must be no debate about global warming. And if I try to go and speak at any university in the United States, an enormous protest will be mounted by communists to say, you mustn't allow this guy on campus because he is a climate change denier. I don't deny that there is climate. I do not deny that it changes. I do not deny that we can have some influence on it. The question is how much? And that is not, whatever they say, settled science. And yet, in your universities and increasingly in your Congress, these questions are not allowed to be debated. And the moment you silence debate, the moment you prevent freedom of thought and speech and action, democracy must fail. And so my charge to all of you is to make sure that you exercise every influence you can upon your elected representatives while they still are elected, to make sure that any university that denies to people like Willie Soon the right to go and give a talk which he has been invited by one of his colleagues at that university to give shall automatically lose its status and its funding and its charter as a university and shall no longer be recognized as a place of learning. And in Congress, if anyone will no longer stand up for freedom of speech, then let him be expelled and let somebody who does be elected in his place. Let us have, once again, the freedom that your founding fathers intended you to have.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you very, very much, Lord.